Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to explore civil rights over the past quarter century, and we'll also look a little beyond 2024 to talk about what the future of civil rights might look like in America over the next 30 to 40 years. You may recall this slide, which ended last week's program. It was written in 2020. That is this cardboard poster. And basically, what it says is that nothing has changed since 1968. On the one hand, there is some truth to that. On the other hand, there have been significant changes. Unfortunately, if you're a young person and you're Black, some of those changes are not particularly evident. Some of it depends on your social economic status. If you're middle class or upper class, a person of color, then things have changed significantly. If you're not, if you're poor, lower income, then America has not changed as much as we thought it would back in the 1960s. And let me give you a specific example of what I mean. Uh, this is compiled from data from 2019. So it's only a few years old, but it's not really much different today. Basically, what this shows is that white families have substantially more wealth than Black families. And you can see here the difference is enormous. For white families, over $188,000. For Black families, slightly over $24,000. Why? Why this great disparity? Well, a key element in this disparity is that whites are homeowners. Blacks, some are homeowners, but most are not. And this figure includes the equity or the value of homes. And you can see the difference between the white wealth and the Black wealth. Well, why is that? If, as I said, the Black middle class has grown significantly since the 1960s, then what accounts for this great disparity? And there are several things working. One thing is a process called redlining. What redlining means is that if you go to a bank and you want to purchase a house, you want to get a loan to purchase a house, the bank has a map of your city. And on that map, the bank has placed different colors: red, blue, green. If your neighborhood that you're purchasing a house is in an area of red, then the bank will not loan you the money for a house. That's called redlining. And invariably, most Black neighborhoods are, in fact, redlined. Now, I should tell you that redlining is not legal, but it's very difficult to prove. Banks do have these maps because if they loan money, the neighborhoods in the red-lined area, the value of those homes is down. In those areas that are green, the value of those homes keeps increasing. So Black families are at a disadvantage in terms of purchasing even a less expensive house. And speaking of less expensive houses, generally the real estate is overpriced in these areas because the sellers, particularly if it's a real estate company, are concerned, well, suppose they don't pay me back. I'm stuck with this house. So I'm going to increase the interest on the loan. And because the realtor and not the bank provides the loan, the interest rates are higher. So for all of these reasons, as well as the historic reasons that we have talked about over the past couple of months, a Black home ownership is way down. And for many families, a home is a great source of wealth, particularly as our population ages. And Black families do not have this cushion or do not have the equity that white families have as a result of home ownership. I don't want to throw numbers at you, but just to give you an example, right now, by the end of 2023, which is the latest figure we have, by the end of 2023, roughly 64% of American families owned their own home. That's the highest in the world of developed nations. But if you look at those figures more carefully, you will see that the percentage for whites is up in the middle to upper 70s, while the percentage for blacks is way down in the 20s and 30s. So that figure, while it looks very healthy, does not really show the lack of home ownership and therefore the lack of equity for Black families. Now, there are other issues besides housing, particularly in the American South. If you're a Black person in the American South today, you see in various cities, and this is in my city of Charlotte, North Carolina, this monument was placed in June of 1920, and it is a tribute to Confederate veterans, that is, those soldiers who fought for the South during the Civil War. And of course, those soldiers fought to perpetuate and save the institution of slavery. So this monument, which is in the center of Charlotte, is a constant reminder not only of the war, but of the subjugation of Black Americans. And what this monument says, a state and city's tribute of love in grateful recognition of the services of the Confederate soldiers whose heroism in war and fidelity in peace have never been surpassed. Accepting the arbitrament of war, in other words, they lost, they preserved the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South. And there you have it, the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South. So that doesn't include Black people. It doesn't include brown people. It doesn't include me. It doesn't include lots of white people, but it includes Anglo-Saxon people, the people from Northern Europe, particularly from the British Isles, except for Ireland, of course. So this is not only a racial monument between black and white. This is also a racial monument for particularly white racial group. And it's typical of Civil War monuments uh, around the South, not only here in North Carolina. Now, if you go through cities in the South, you will find monuments. Go through any city, you will find monuments. I'm sure there are monuments in Minsk, and there are monuments in Moscow, and of course, and there are monuments here in Columbia, South Carolina, which is just an hour and a half drive from my house. And uh, this is the grounds of the State House, in other words, the state capitol in Columbia, South Carolina. And you can see here at the fringe of this photo the South Carolina state flag and the American flag on top of it. And around the State House, there are several statues. And one of them is a statue of uh, governor who was governor of South Carolina in the 1870s and 1880s. Okay, that is not unusual, but first, why is he riding a horse? Secondly, why is he dressed in a Confederate uniform? The Civil War was long over in the late 1870s. But again, when this statue was raised in South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina, the idea was that we're still fighting the Civil War. And by golly, we're not going to show our governor just in a suit standing on a podium. We're going to show him on his horse, on his cavalry horse, in his Confederate uniform. And again, what this does, if you're a black person, this excludes you. You're invisible. You're not part of this society. Little later on in the 20th century, uh, here's a statue of a former governor of South Carolina, like Wade Hampton, and also a senator, Strom Thurmond. Thurmond passed away about 15 years ago, so this is not really something that's way back in the 20th century or the 19th century even. But here you have a monument to Strom Thurmond. Well, who was Strom Thurmond? Strom Thurmond led the move of Southern states out of the Democratic Party in 1948 to form the Dixiecrat Party because Harry Truman, as we have seen, wanted to pass civil rights laws that would protect the equality of all races, particularly Black Americans. And Strom Thurmond was opposed to that. And but here is his statue. And if you're a Black person, you come to the State House and you see Wade Hampton on a horse in his Confederate uniform. and Strom Thurmond on a pedestal, what does that tell you about yourself and your people and how much they are valued by your state? But keep this statue in mind because we're going to come back to it and I'm going to show you something that is very interesting about this statue. Now, in 2017, the Nazis marched in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is not Germany, by the way. This is Charlottesville, Virginia. And they marched against racial equality. And notice the flags here. Of course, I'm sure you are familiar with the swastika flag, but this is the Southern, the Confederate battle flag. And you see one here, and you see one there as well. And on this man's shirt, you see an outline of the Confederate flag. And that, of course, underscores the fact that the Confederacy, Southern states, that new country they founded in the 1860s, was a country that was predicated on white supremacy and had a great deal in common with the Nazis in Germany. However, and I don't want to continue showing you bad news about uh, my home and America generally, because things have changed. Things have changed. And I'm going to show you how they have changed. And we will come to hopefully a conclusion about what the future looks like. Uh, One of the most visited tourist attractions in America is Monticello. Monticello is in Virginia, just north of my state of North Carolina. And it is the home of Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, those wonderful words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Well, when I was a student at the University of Maryland, I went to Monticello. It's about a 2 hour drive from Washington, D.C. And I was given a tour of Monticello. At the time, you would never know that there were slaves, that Thomas Jefferson had dozens of slaves at his home in Monticello. The guide called them servants. Okay, well, you know, people in England have servants on their big estates and so on. Uh, Never called them slaves. And we never saw where the slaves lived. You go to Monticello today, and one of the first places your guide will take you to is Mulberry Row. And Mulberry Row is the place in Monticello where the slaves lived. And you can see remnants on the from some of the buildings and the woodpile and so on. And you get a story about the slaves, which you never got even 20 or 30 years ago. So in telling our history, we have become much broader, much more complete, much more whole. And that I think is a positive. Mississippi, the most segregated state in America. Mississippi several years ago approved legislation to construct the Civil Rights Museum. we are going to show America and the citizens of Mississippi, we're going to show them what our Black brothers and sisters and how our Black brothers and sisters lived in our state. We're going to make them visible. No longer invisible, we're going to make them visible. Now, going back to Virginia, we have a community called Williamsburg. Williamsburg used to be the capital of the state of Virginia. Now, of course, it's Richmond. But the Rockefeller family decided that they would preserve Williamsburg as Virginia's colonial capital. Now, if you went there 20 years ago, you would never see this because, again, Black people were servants. And certainly you wouldn't find a Black person tilling the land. But if you wanted to make a true rendering of history, if you go to Williamsburg today, this is what you see. And this young Black man is actually a student at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he's picking up a few extra dollars working as a slave in Williamsburg. And you can see the tourists here watching him. He's tilling the soil because that's what Black people did. They worked on farms, and he's tilling the soil, preparing it for planting. So we're much more honest about our history when we include Black people doing what they did. Now, this is not a Black person, this is a white woman. And again, it's on the grounds of the South Carolina State House. Now, why am I showing you a statue of a white woman? I mean, so what? It was a statue commemorating white women during the American Civil War. And you can see she has a book open on her lap. Uh, it's the Bible, and she's certainly not smiling. The sculptor of this statue back in the 19th century wanted to show the sacrifice of women during the Civil War. It wasn't a tribute to, yeah, okay, let's go out there and kill those Yankees. Let's go out there and preserve slavery. No, this was a statue to commemorate white women and the sacrifices they made for the Confederacy. So the interpretation of the statue has changed over the years, focusing more on the heroism of white women rather on their meek acceptance of the war and their support of the men. And so not only, I mean, the statute didn't change, but the interpretation changed to better reflect the purpose of the sculptor. Now, this is again on the state grounds of the capital of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, what in the world do we have here? Well, you can see we have a wall. And the wall depicts something. You can't really see it closely, but you can see this child and these tourists looking at the wall. Well, what does the wall depict? The wall depicts the history of black people in South Carolina. From the time the first slave ship landed in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina until the present. In other words, what the government of South Carolina is doing is they are writing and displaying their black citizens as part of the culture and history, even if that history is not very positive, that they are part of this state, that they are part of our history. Now, what is this here? This is the outline of a slave ship. Now, here in the South, we don't like to spread bad news. We like to be positive all the time and tell everybody everything is fine, we're doing great, it's wonderful. But that's not how our history has been. And we cannot come to terms with our history. We cannot come to terms with the people who are living today unless we come to terms with our history. And so here is the outline of a slave ship. And I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but you see these are actual slaves who were crammed in to this ship, just hundreds of them at a time. So they could barely move on the voyage from Africa to South Carolina. So coming to grips with your history uh, has been one of the most important things that have changed race relations, not only here in the South, but in America. It's not economic, it's history. Now, let me come back. You all remember Strom Thurmond's statue, you know, with his suit and standing tall. This is a marker on the side of that statue. Okay. Um, Strom Thurmond was a statesman, a soldier, an educator. Okay, so what? But look down here. There's something wrong with this marker. Uh, it says here, the father of 5 children. Well, what's wrong with this 5? It looks out of place. It's not smooth and clear like the rest of the narrative. Well, up until 2 years ago, this said the father of 4 children. Now, wait a second. This guy's been dead for over 20 years. How could he suddenly go from 4 children to 5 children 2 years ago? Well, the story is that he had a black lover. This arch segregationist, this arch racist had a black woman as a lover. And he fathered a child with her. So the state of North Carolina, South Carolina, the state of South Carolina had to change the stone. Well, how do you change this stone? Well, obviously you take it down and you put up a new one that says the father of 5 children. No, they were not going to do that. They wanted to attract attention to this secret that Strom Thurmond held throughout his life. And he lived a long life. He died when he was 101 years old. So that's a pretty, very long life. but he kept that secret. And they decided, okay, we're going to scrape off four, and it's still four letters, right? Four and FIVE. We're going to scrape off four and we're going to put five there, but we're going to make sure that people are drawn to it because it's, although the type is the same, it's obviously different from the rest of the plaque. Now, speaking of statues, University of Texas in Austin, if you go to the center of campus, you will see statues of Confederate generals. You will also see now a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. Again, we're not going to take down the Confederate statues, but we're going to put up statues of Black heroes too. And that's what Texas has done. On the other hand, we are going to take down statues of those individuals who made war on the United States. And the most prominent of that group was the president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was from Kentucky, and here is his statue in Lexington, Kentucky, and it's being removed, not disappeared. It's going into a museum, but it's being removed from being in a public place. Because why should we pay honor? Why should we pay homage to someone who made war on the United States of America? That does not make any sense. In Richmond, Virginia, here is the equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee, who was the commanding general of the Confederate forces. And you can see what people have done to his monument. It's now basically graffiti. And the monument now is gone. They have taken it down and will put it in a museum. The idea is that we should not erect monuments to traitors. We should not erect monuments to those leaders who left the United States to perpetuate the institution of slavery. So what I'm saying is that we're coming to terms with our history, and that is good. We're not sweeping it under the rug. We're not excluding a large group of people from that history. We're becoming more inclusive. And as part of that inclusiveness, in Jackson, Mississippi, again, Mississippi had the reputation of being the most racist state in America. They have erected this beautiful civil rights museum. And in this civil rights museum, what you can see are Ku Klux Klan uniforms. They don't bury them. They want to show this is what we were like. And it is important to see this, not bury it, but it's important to see this and come to terms with the way we were. And so you can see the Ku Klux Klan uniforms there. And in Montgomery, Alabama, where the civil rights movement really began in 1955, as we've noted with the Montgomery bus boycott, there is a memorial for all those Black people who were lynched who were murdered by whites, not only in the 1950s and 1960s, but going back to the 19th century. And it's just a beautiful memorial, as you can see here. And it's dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Now, if some of my students tell me that America is a racist country, certainly there is racism in this country. And we've talked about it and we've seen it. But at the same time, we did elect a black man as president of the United States. Now, if you're elected president, you have to get white votes because black voters are only about 12 or 13% of the total numbers of votes. So we had a black president. Not only did we have a black president, but we have now a black vice president, Kamala Harris. So this would have been inconceivable in the 1960s. It just something that would never happen in the 1960s or even the 1970s or 80s. But we have changed for the better, despite some of the economic issues, despite some of the rhetoric you may hear during this presidential campaign. We have, in fact, changed for the better. Not only that, but we have become a multiracial society. Now, I'm not going to offer this course again in 2065 for obvious reasons, but you can see what has happened uh, over the past 60 years, or at least since 1965. And as I said, blacks are about 13% of the total population. But very interestingly, whites will be a minority. We will not have a majority population of any color. We'll have Asian, Hispanic, black, and white, and other 3%. So you see, for 120 for 100 years, the white population will shrink, and it will continue to shrink on into the 22nd century. And when I go into a classroom, I am teaching my students to expect and to be comfortable with these changing demographics, because this is what they'll be working and living through. Now, the fastest growing population in America right now are Asians. Many people think, oh, it's Hispanics, people coming from it. No, no, it's Asians. And as you can see here, historically, not that much, but after 2012, that has increased and Hispanics have declined. And you can see here something that's very interesting. The median household income of the US population, 49,800. Whites, of course, are higher, and blacks, as we noted, are the lowest. But look at Asians, $66,000. That's higher, much higher than the median population, particularly if you're from India or the Philippines or Japan or China. Uh, these folks who are coming in are well educated, and if they're not well educated, they become well educated quite quickly, and they take their place in the larger society. So the challenge, I think, over the next 30 or 40 years is to keep in mind that Black Americans have had a very different history from the history of Hispanics, Asians, or any other ethnic group, because unlike other ethnic groups, Black people were slaves. They did not come here voluntarily. All these other folks came voluntarily. But that is a distinction, and it's a distinction that slowly but surely we're coming to not only recognize, but coming to change as as well. Now, as part of this, uh, people are of many different races. We had a census in 2020. We have a census every 10 years. So the most recent census is 2020. And this young woman, Michelle Lopez Mullins, and you can see her here, she's filling out um, her her census form, and there are different categories. Yeah, she's Hispanic. Um, yeah, she's also Asian. Yeah, she also is Native American. The strict racial categories and ethnic categories, it's very, very difficult for many Americans to say exactly who they are. So Michelle Lopez Mullins is part Irish, part Peruvian, part Chinese, part Cherokee and Shawnee. I mean, that is the future. She is the future of America. And part of the reason for this future is that we marry each other. Uh, and as you can see here, intermarriage rates, particularly among immigrant groups like Asians and Hispanics. In fact, the number one intermarriage ethnicity are Japanese women. 55% of Japanese women marry outside of Asian ethnicity. And as you can see here, that's true of Asians generally. But we're going to become a more mixed population. Now you see here, blacks 15.5%. That was in 1970, that was below 4%. So you can see that the idea of marrying a white person marrying a black person, or Hispanic marrying a black person, and so on, has become much more common over the past half century. Now I will conclude with this photograph. The most diverse city in America is Houston, Texas. And I went to a daycare in Houston. I was visiting a friend there. And this is, it wasn't a staged picture. In other words, I didn't pick children from all over the place just so they could be here. There is just children at a daycare center in Houston, Texas. Houston is the most diverse city in America. And these youngsters, most of whom were 3, 4, 5 years old, these youngsters will grow up in a very different country from the country I grew up in. And personally, I think that's good. They will interact with a greater diversity of kids and eventually adults than I interacted with. And maybe 20 or 30 years from now, people will wonder, well, why did we have a racial problem in America? Why did we have a problem in civil rights? That doesn't make sense because we're all different, yet that difference makes us all the same. So I want to leave you with this grain of optimism. I know we've seen some really bad things over the past few months, and we still have some bad things to address here in America. But I am optimistic that, at least in biology, we will eventually resolve that problem. And if you, as many Americans do, call America a nation of immigrants, at last, that will be the true title of our country. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor. So now we have time for Q&A. Guys, who will be first?